of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Allies on the fence. The president's push for help reopening the Strait of Hormuz is met with a mixed response.
Some are very enthusiastic and some are less than enthusiastic. And I assume some will not do it. They should be jumping to help us because we've helped them for years stay out of war.
The president now saying he's requested to delay his trip to China by a month due to the war with Iran. We'll discuss the latest with New Hampshire Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander as the DHS shutdown passes the 30-day mark. Plus, Cuba goes dark. An island-wide blackout leaves millions without power. The national grid collapse comes amid a near-total fuel blockade by the United States, what it could mean for ongoing talks between the two nations. And Nvidia's $1 trillion target. The chipmaker says its AI chips could generate at least $1 trillion in revenue by the end of 2027. Is the news enough to reignite shares? Bloomberg Tech host Ed Ludlow joins us this hour with the latest. But we begin with the latest from the White House. President Trump speaking to the press just a few moments ago from the Oval Office, making news on a potential delay of his trip to China and also on Cuba after appealing for help with the Strait of Hormuz, criticizing allies and threatening more strikes on Iran in remarks earlier today.
We don't need oil. We have all the oil we need for ourselves. It's one of the great assets that we have. We have more than double what anybody else in terms of oil production. We don't know who their leader is. We have people wanting to negotiate. We have no idea who they are. A lot of people are saying that he's badly disfigured. They're saying that he lost his leg, the one leg, and he's been hurt very badly. Other people are saying he's dead. Nobody's saying he's 100% healthy. It takes ship owners, and these ships are very expensive. They can cost up to $2 billion. So they don't want to take a chance that, gee, I think you'll be okay. They got to know it.
For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse. Skylar, obviously, we heard a lot from the president earlier today. We just heard more from him in the Oval Office, including this news that he's requested a delay for his trip to China that was scheduled to take place at the end of this month. What do we know?
Yeah, Kaylee, this comes as the president has called on nations, including China, to help assist in reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The president has called on China, Japan, the UK, and other European nations to help the U.S. in reopening that strait. So the news that he is now looking to delay his trip is something we had heard rumors about, but it sounds like the president confirmed it. And that's just sort of the latest development in the war in Iran. And clearly the president is trying to use this as sort of a bargaining trip to try and get potentially China to offer some assistance. But historically, China has not really intervened. And when it comes to wars, it will be interesting to see, one, if China approves the president's request to delay his trip, and if China ultimately decides to offer any assistance.
Well, of course, it's not just China that we have the assistance in question. It's other allies as well. The president today suggested that he's fairly satisfied with France. I believe he said he'd give Macron an 8 out of 10 in this regard. Not so with the UK, though. Skylar, how much pressure is he able to put on these European countries to try to get them on board with this notion of a kind of coalition to open the strait?
Yeah, well, the president, ever since taking office, even before the war in Iran kicked off, he sort of threatened these countries a lot with different things, whether it be with tariffs. He's talked about NATO and how he feels that the U.S. is always offering support, but doesn't feel that NATO is having having the U.S.'s back in situations. So it'll be interesting to see how these countries respond, especially as time goes on, that the president continues to sort of launch these attacks towards these European countries, like what we're seeing with the UK. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, I think the president is really pushing to have some assistance from his European allies and the UK. But only time will tell to see if those leaders come to the table and actually start to work with the U.S. and President Trump.
All right, Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse, thank you so much, helping us recap President Trump's remarks, which included just a short time ago him telling reporters regarding Iran, quote, "Had we not done this, you would have had a nuclear war that would have evolved into World War III." Joining me now with her reaction to that statement and all of the events unfolding in the Middle East is Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire, who serves on both the House Armed Services Committee and Small Business Committee. She also served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve for 11 years. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As you hear the president suggesting that this could have been World War III had the U.S. not acted now, obviously he is making the case that this was kind of preventative in nature. Now that we are in it, though, how do we conclude things? What do you see as the end game or off-ramp here, and how close are we to that point?
Well, thanks so much for having me. Look, here's what I'd say. The president came before Congress just a few days before he unilaterally launched this war of choice in Iran. He gave the longest State of the Union in American history. And what he said about Iran's nuclear program was what he told the country and the world last summer, which is that the program was totally obliterated. So it has been a dizzying, shifting, and, in my view, downright dangerous approach that the president has taken by failing to be clear about the basic rationale for this war, our objectives in this war, and how we're going to achieve them. And I think that is why we are seeing so many of our allies around the world not stepping up in our hour of need, because this president has failed to be clear about his basic objectives and what we're doing here. And these are the most consequential decisions that any president could make. The president chose not to come to the Congress. He should do that now. He should be answering to the American people, to every service member in this country, to every military family in this country. He needs to give a clear case for what it is we are doing, because 13 American patriots have given their lives in this war, and the American people deserve answers from this president.
Well, as we consider those 13 service members that have died, Congresswoman, knowing that more service members are being sent to the region as we speak, what is the latest the Armed Services Committee has received in terms of information about what is going to be asked of the American military next, whether we could actually be seeing some of these service members physically on the ground, not just helping and aiding in the conducting of aerial operations?
Look, we will be relentless in pressing for answers to these basic questions. But the fact is that this is the least transparent Pentagon in American history. We don't have a free press inside the Pentagon. And when you're in the middle of a war, having credible journalists who can help to shine a light. Sunlight is the most powerful disinfectant, I believe, in government. And we've never seen a more determined effort in this country to systematically try to silence the free press and experienced journalists, who have dedicated their lives to covering the Pentagon, who were sent out of that building right away. I know that's still in litigation, but the fact is that Congress relies on the most basic tools that have always been at our disposal: a free press, an inspector general's office that is staffed with professionals and not political appointees. We are not getting the kind of hearings that you would expect. We have not heard from the Secretary of Defense. He should be coming before the House and Senate Armed Services Committee without delay, and every member of Congress should be forced to vote on our War Powers Resolution, which is a bipartisan resolution that we brought forward just 2 weeks ago. We should continue to press, because this is our basic responsibility under our Constitution.
Congresswoman, as I mentioned, you did serve 11 years in the U.S. Navy Reserves, and I wonder, when you hear the president simultaneously saying we need other countries to join us in a sort of coalition to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but also we do not need them, which it is, if the U.S. Navy is capable of reopening the Strait and holding it, making sure that it's secure for transit on its own?
The commander-in-chief, the president, he owes the truth and he owes clarity. He owes a sober head and steady hands at the helm to each and every American who's put their trust in him and who is relying on him to be our commander-in-chief in this war of choice. It is dizzying, and it is deeply upsetting to me to hear the president make 180s multiple times a day about what our objectives are and what our capabilities are. This is no way to run a war. And what he owes each and every one of us is a clear explanation of how this ends. What is the path to victory here? Because so far, what we've seen is the Strait of Hormuz close, which is crushing hardworking people at the gas pump, at the grocery store. It's crushing our farmers. It's going to make costs go up across the board. It threatens a global recession. The risks cannot be, and the costs cannot be understated. At the same time, if what we're trying to do is eliminate Iran's nuclear program, so far, I don't think we have anything to show on that front. If our goal is regime change, well, what have we seen there? We've seen an 86-year-old Ayatollah replaced with a 56-year-old Ayatollah. And that, to me, that's not a good case to make to the American people for a war. So the president owes us clear answers, and Congress has got to step up and do its basic job. And that's what I'm working to do every day.
Well, Congresswoman, you mentioned regime change in Iran. I also have a question about whether or not we might soon see regime change in Cuba. Obviously, officials on the island today said there had been an island-wide blackout as we're seeing the U.S. put pressure on its energy resources. And President Trump just said in the Oval Office when asked about Cuba that he believes he'll have, and this is a quote, the honor of taking it. And I wonder what you understand that to mean, Congresswoman, and given the immense pressure we are seeing in Cuba, if this is the opportune time, if the U.S. was ever going to seize it.
Well, look, I don't know what the president meant, but what I do know is that this is not the first time that he's talked about seizing other countries. You know, I never expected that I would be joining together with a bipartisan group of colleagues to introduce legislation just a few weeks ago. This was not a messaging bill. This is legislation that says that no taxpayer dollars can be used to advance a military operation against a NATO ally. And we are pushing this bill because we have a president at the helm who has spoken casually and seriously and repeatedly about using our military to attack our most important allies in the world. This is dangerous. This is really unbecoming of any president of the United States. And it is time for serious people to step up. And that is what we've got to do in this country.
And finally, Congresswoman, I'd like to ask you about the ongoing shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security, which has now stretched for over a month and is having a real impact specifically at America's airports as TSA agents are now going without pay. This is something I spoke about with the president and CEO for Airlines for America, former New Hampshire governor, in fact, who I'm sure you're quite familiar with, Chris Sununu. This is what he told me, and I'll have you respond.
These are some of the lowest paid employees that have been going on. They just got a zero paycheck. They're going into their fourth week of not being paid. Imagine averaging $35,000 a year. Yeah. 3 or 4 weeks is a lot, right? If you're a single mom and you're working, you know, you're TSO and you're working, and all of a sudden you're not bringing a paycheck home for 4 weeks, well, yeah, that's real pressure on the system, and that will continue to build. I think the Republicans have actually done a pretty good job of saying, okay, we'll give in on these issues, but we got to fund this thing, you know, as a whole. Democrats aren't moving right now. Leadership is not talking, and that's probably the most frustrating part.
And we do understand, Congresswoman, that the Democrats are planning to put forward a discharge petition to fund the other elements of the Department of Homeland Security, ex-ICE. Do you plan to vote for that?
Well, I have voted for that bill, and 6 times in the House and in the Senate, we have tried to bring forward a bill, a common sense bill that every member of Congress should be able to get behind, and that is to fund TSA, to fund FEMA, to fund our men and women in the Coast Guard. 6 times we've tried to do this, and I will not quit in that effort because there is no reason that our public servants who went through the longest shutdown in American history last fall, who are still feeling the pain of that shutdown, should be missing a paycheck. I am not accepting a paycheck because I believe no member of Congress should be paid when federal public servants are being forced to work without pay. The Speaker of the House should allow for this common sense bill to come forward to fund the parts of the Department of Homeland Security that are not funded. Now, to be clear, there are 2 parts of the department, ICE and Border Patrol, who right now have more funding than they've ever had in their history. In fact, the $150 billion blank check that was given to the Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Kristi Noem by the president's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, H.R. 1. That was a blank check that made ICE an agency that is funded at a higher level than the rest of federal law enforcement agencies across government combined. This blank check has been used against American citizens who have been shot dead in broad daylight. And what we're asking for are common sense guardrails on these two parts of the department that are so important to the responsible enforcement of our laws and in keeping our communities safe. And what the Speaker and the President have done at every turn is to try to derail this, to hold hostage funding that should be flowing directly to pay our federal public servants, to make sure FEMA is up and running. And they aren't allowing this to move forward, but we will not quit in our effort to get that done, because this is our most basic responsibility as Congress, to be funding the government responsibly.
All right, Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire, thank you for joining us. Thank you. Now, Brent crude closed above $100 a barrel for a third straight session today, the longest such streak since August of 2022, as investors remain on edge about the impact of supply disruptions in the Middle East. And for the details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, crude prices still remain elevated, Kaylee. The good news is they did come down a tad on the day, about 2.5% on Brent crude and 5% on WTI crude. And at least for some investors in the equity space, that was all they really needed to see here. There's been a lot of concerns here about the potential economic ripples from elevated oil prices, but with a light, at least in the minds of some investors, at the end of the tunnel with regards to the increase in those prices, they did pile back into stocks. Of course, that was coming off of 4 straight days of losses on the S&P 500, and S&P 500 that rallied about 1% here on the day. Similar moves for most of the major indices, but there is a lot of skepticism right now among strategists on Wall Street saying, be careful here, that we're still in the midst of a war that still has not actually provided any sort of meaningful end to it. And we're still seeing oil prices about 40% higher than where they were before the war began. And that says nothing, Kaylee, of what we're seeing at the pump. If you're going to pump gasoline today, on average, you're seeing prices up roughly about 25 to 26% than where they were just about 17, 18 days ago. And that is the backdrop, Kaylee, for that Fed meeting, which kicks off tomorrow, a 2-day Fed meeting, and a big summary of economic projections that they have to put out on Wednesday that most likely, at least according to Bloomberg analysts, will likely show an increase in their expectations for inflation for the rest of the year. And that could have a big impact on the psychology of this market.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you. Coming up, President Trump says the U.S. is hammering Iran's capacity to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. We'll have more with Conley of the American Enterprise Institute next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines. Just a few moments ago, President Trump, speaking from the Oval Office, provided a status update on the ongoing conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and also told reporters that he has requested a delay by a month of his planned trip to Beijing and a meeting with China's Xi Jinping. Joining me now with her reaction to this is Conley, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. Heather, welcome back to Bloomberg. When we consider this notion that the president, because of the ongoing war in the Middle East, has requested a 1-month delay of his trip to China, is a 1-month delay going to be adequate given the way in which this conflict seems to be escalating, not de-escalating?
Yeah, Kaylee, great to be with you. We don't know when the war is going to end. Israeli officials have noted they are prepared to proceed for the next 3 to 4 weeks. So we can imagine that this could exceed another month. But this is a big decision that certainly the president has been looking forward to this visit to Beijing, the policy preparation that's gone into place. But I think the White House completely understood that the optics would be terrible as a war is raging. American servicemen and women are in harm's way while he is being feted in Beijing. So I think this is a really big deal that it's been postponed. But again, I think it's correct. The president needs to stay laser focused on a conflict that's spreading by the day.
Well, as you talk about the White House having an understanding, at least, of the optics, do you believe that this White House, this administration, had an understanding of just how dire the situation could become with the Strait of Hormuz, specifically that the president is now suggesting other countries might need to get involved for it to reopen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the White House, I think the president in particular, was lulled a bit by the extraordinary success of last June's 12-day war, the extraordinary success of our military operation in Venezuela in January, and I believe made an assumption that this would be similar in scope, and it just was a misreading of the situation. Our military for decades has been preparing for, the potential of a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. These have been, exercise, war games, and things like that. But it was very clear the administration had not laid the groundwork. And this is what we're seeing with the involvement of our allies. If you need help, and in this particular case, we now need assistance, you have to bring those allies in from the beginning. Yes, that takes time. Yes, it takes patience. But it's very hard in the middle of operations to say, oops, now I need help. That ground wasn't laid. And this is, I think, a very important example of why having as many allies and countries on your side when you decide to take the difficult steps that we have, you need that support, particularly when the conflict goes into extra innings. And I think we are seeing a conflict that's going into extra innings.
Okay, so Heather, if there's not the political or diplomatic capital to try to kind of force allies to the table here, if you will, could there not eventually be economic incentive for these countries to get more directly involved? We're talking about China, which gets the vast majority of Iran's oil exports. We're talking about Europe, which already had to diversify away from Russian energy products and is now facing this supply shortage coming from the Middle East. Are they not going to have economic reason to want the Strait of Hormuz open and potentially do what they need to do in order to see that happen?
Yeah, I mean, Kaylee, this is what's so interesting about the Iranian strategy, because they are dividing countries. So the strait is open. It is open for Iranian tankers to go to China, to go to India, today to Pakistan. And the Iranian regime has basically said, if countries separate themselves from the United States and from Israel, potentially they'll allow those tankers to go through as well. And I mean, the Trump administration is allowing this. They're not stopping for the moment these tankers. So this is a separation strategy, and I think right now it's successful. You're absolutely right on Europe. This is a double whammy. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Europeans diversified their energy towards the Middle East and to U.S. LNG. And now this is obviously an issue for Europe. And so, yes, I think there will be increased interest in European and potentially our Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, when the conflict ends or when hostilities end, and if there is an international mandate to do this. But right now, in times of trouble, our allies look to the greatest military in the world, the United States, and they're not sure how they're going to engage right now.
All right, Heather, appreciate you joining us. Heather Conley, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And we'll have more coming up on Balance of Power, what we learned from Nvidia's GTC conference today. We'll get those details next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm here to tell you that right now where I stand, a few short months after GTC DC, 1 year after last GTC, right here where I stand, I see through 2027 at least $1 trillion.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines, and that was Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang delivering the keynote address at Nvidia's GTC conference in San Jose, California, earlier this afternoon. And joining me now with all of the details is Bloomberg Tech's Ed Ludlow, who was on the ground at today's conference. So, Ed, we're throwing out the big numbers now.
Yeah, it's $1 trillion, a headline that moved markets first massively to the upside, but then Wall Street had some time to do the math and understand the definition of what that figure is, and markets came back down. It is $1 trillion between 2025 and 2027. The prior forecast had been for 5 fiscal quarters from the end of 2025 to the end of calendar 2026, and there was a $500 billion figure that only reflected Blackwell and Rubin system sales. So there are still questions to be posed on what that figure really represents. We're basically interpreting it as cumulatively you are seeing a $1 trillion figure over 2 calendar years, and that it's basically Nvidia giving its outlook further afield, more visibility on what AI demand is showing Nvidia, and that was the story overall. The demand story is intact.
Well, so if the demand story is still a stellar one, I do wonder about kind of supply questions, if any of them could emanate from what we're seeing in the Middle East, where we know helium, sulfur, things you need to make chips. If you're a company like Taiwan Semiconductor, it's going to be harder to get access to those, at least for the time being. What impact is that likely to have, Ed?
Yeah, so helium is a good conductor, but it's inert, which makes it very useful in cooling when you are at the cutting edge of chip manufacturing. It's also used in etching and deposition stages. But the data that you need to understand is that helium is principally sourced from countries like Qatar, and it flows to Taiwan in particular. So there is some logic that it would be disrupted and that in real terms that supply would be impacted. I would also note that the vast majority of lead-edge chips are transferred from Taiwan and Korea via air freight. Basically, the more valuable the chip, it gets itself a business class seat on a plane. And so that will result in muted impact. Jensen Huang didn't really address the supply chain or bottlenecks in the course of his presentation, other than to say it's very hard to get hold of GPUs. But tomorrow he'll speak to both analysts, investors, and then the press for a very extended period of time. And it's almost certain that he'll be asked about it, so you can watch for headlines for that over the course of Tuesday.
All right, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, thank you so much. You can, of course, catch Ed alongside Caroline Hyde every morning on Bloomberg Tech, starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV. Now, President Trump has requested help from China to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, where things for chips, of course, energy flows through, at least on an ordinary day, but not in recent weeks. A short time ago, he also shares that he's requested a 1-month delay in his planned trip to meet with China's Xi Jinping after making that request. Take a listen.
I don't know. We're working on that right now. We're speaking to China. I'd love to, but because of the war, I want to be here. I have to be here, I feel. And so we've requested that we delay it a month.
Joining me now with her insight is Jennifer Welch, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst at Bloomberg Economics. So clearly, Jenny, the president is just pitching this as it's a 1-month delay. But I wonder if you think this will have any real impact on what the outcome of those talks could be now, if indeed China agrees to push them back.
I think it's unlikely to have a major impact on negotiations. For one, I think Beijing will probably be relieved to hear that the trip is getting pushed back. We were hearing that Beijing was rather frustrated at the United States not doing much advanced planning ahead of the summit. China likes to plan these sort of things in advance and in great detail, and Washington was obviously focused elsewhere. So I think they'll see this as a relief and likely are just going to pick things up whenever the visit does happen, whether it's next month or later. There was not necessarily a forcing event that required it to happen later this month.
Well, fair enough. So maybe if China is going to be inclined to accept that request and delay the meeting, I wonder, Jenny, if you think they'd be as inclined to do what the president asks when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, suggesting that China, together with other world powers, U.S. allies, most of them, should be lending a helping hand in making sure it is secure for transit. Do you see China, or any other country for that matter, as likely to participate in that?
I think that's a request that China is going to be disinclined to grant for a number of reasons. First, the economic impact of this war on China has actually been far less than I think what many would have expected, given how dependent China is on oil from the Middle East. It has significant reserves. It seems that it's still able to access some of the tankers that are still flowing through Hormuz, perhaps through its private negotiations with Tehran. And Beijing doesn't see this as its war. It doesn't want to get directly involved. In fact, it views Iran as a strategic partner. So I think it is extremely unlikely that China is going to get involved. It's also unlikely that any other U.S. traditional allies even are going to want to contribute to this, given that this is a war that was started largely without coordination with them. And it's an incredibly risky operational affair for them to send their warships directly into an active combat zone.
Okay, so if it's not likely that the U.S. is going to find partners in this effort, I guess I wonder, Jenny, if you see this effort as one that can be successful, if the U.S. pursues it alone, or if we're really just talking about a Strait of Hormuz that is going to remain effectively shut for the foreseeable future.
The U.S. certainly has significant military assets that it can bring to bear in providing more protection and coverage for ships going through the strait. Earlier this month, there was discussion that the U.S. Navy would be prepared to do that by the end of the month. I think a lot depends, too, on what threat Iran is still posing by that point. Is it putting out mines? Is it just directing projectiles towards ships? That will in part determine the timeline. Removing mines takes time, for example. I think the other question, though, is beyond the military arena, but in the insurance arena. Is the United States going to be willing to, as President Trump had signaled earlier, provide insurance for tankers going through the strait now that many insurers have removed that war coverage? And that could end up being a very costly affair, and one that it's not even clear if the DFC, which Trump had originally charged with doing this, has the ability and the authority to do that on this timeline.
All right, Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua sat down today with Finnish President Alexander Stubb to discuss this ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And she started by asking him what he believes needs to happen next.
I think we now need to de-escalate rather than escalate. So what we probably need is peace mediation. The actual original operation was not discussed with allies, but I'm sure that President Trump is now in conversation with the UK, with France, Germany, the big players.
I think President Trump said that NATO faces a very bad future if U.S. allies fail to assist. How should we take that?
Well, I think, we obviously have to take everything that the President of the United States says seriously. I think the key now is to focus on the alliance and what we do. We are a defensive alliance, which means that we don't do military attacks as such. We're 32 countries. Of course, after the Cold War, we had some peacekeeping missions, but they were always justified through international law and UN charters. So this is quite different from that.
Do you think the U.S. should be helped?
I think those countries that have the capacity and the will to help the United States will do that and should do that. We have to understand that the situation, of course, in the Middle East and in the Gulf region right now is extremely serious. We have Iran that has attacked somewhere between 10 to 13 different countries with missiles and drones, and that's why I think any de-escalatory measure right now would be very useful. Iran's interest, though, the problem here is that Iran seems to have three interests. One is to cause damage to its neighbors. Two is to maximize the harm on the global economy through the oil price. And the third one is to keep up their current regime.
But how does this de-escalate? First of all, who are the right people or the right person to try and help?
Well, we need a ceasefire. So I'm just wondering whether the Europeans or actually India could get involved. We saw Foreign Minister Jaishankar calling for a ceasefire and negotiations just to calm down the temperature and freeze the situation as it is. The problem in these kinds of situations is when you kind of have three players, Israel, the US, and Iran, all with more or less different interests. It's very difficult for them to organize themselves into a peace kind of a situation.
Do you have a clear understanding of what the US is trying to achieve?
I think the original aim, and obviously I don't want to give advice to the US administration, but from what I understand, number one was to shut down the Iranian nuclear program. Number 2 was to damage their capability in terms of missiles and both launching and defense. Number 3 were the proxies, so terrorist organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And number 4 was regime change. And then, of course, you're going to have to ask the American administration which one of this is more important, which one is going to materialize.
President Stubb, the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas was talking about repurposing the EU's Red Sea naval mission to the Strait of Hormuz. Is this a good idea?
Well, I haven't seen the latest reports on the EU foreign ministers meeting, but that could be one way of helping out. But that is for the EU foreign ministers to decide, and I think they're still sitting as we are having this conversation, so I don't know the outcome.
And I understand you're calling for de-escalation, but how worried are you that this actually escalates, that the conflict widens?
I'm worried because what we used to see, especially after the Cold War, were local conflicts, almost like wars of civil wars. Now we're seeing regional. I mean, first we saw Israel, Palestine, then we've seen Russia, Ukraine, and now of course we see Iran and 10 to 13 countries. So of course I'm worried. And to all of my European friends or American friends, I sort of asked the question that how would we feel if there were missiles flying in our region to 13 different countries? Of course, we would be extremely worried. And that is the mindset that I think a lot of the countries in the Gulf region and in the Middle East have, because they didn't want this war. And that's the problem. That's why I think we need to bring down the temperature. The United States military has shown its might. There's no question about that. They've hit X amount of targets quite successfully. But now it's time to please calm down.
There are also media reports that actually Russia was reportedly sharing intelligence with Iran on the location of U.S. forces. Yeah. Is that true?
Well, it's super worrying, yes. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. And this is what I try to tell my American friends as well, that, there are two elements of this. One is that Russia is now giving shaheeds back to Iran, which they can hit American bases. And two, they're giving intelligence about where the American bases are. So basically giving the executive order to kill American soldiers, and I'd be very worried about that.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with the Finnish President Alexander Stubb online or on the terminal. Still ahead, FCC Chair Brendan Carr is threatening to cancel broadcasters' licenses if they do not correct course on their news coverage. We'll bring you those details and discuss with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. In tonight's Power Brief, President Trump announced that White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles has been diagnosed with breast cancer. In a post on True Social, he said the cancer was in an early stage and that Wiles plans to continue to work as she undergoes treatment. Wiles confirmed the news with her own post. She is the first female to serve as a chief of staff to a president, which is often called the second most powerful job in Washington. In a statement, Wiles said she was, quote, deeply thankful for the support and encouragement of President Trump. According to the American Cancer Society, roughly 1 in 8 women in the U.S. have the chance of developing breast cancer. A federal judge has paused the Trump administration's decision to slash the number of recommended vaccines for children. The decision stems from a lawsuit brought by medical groups against Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. over his dramatic overhaul of childhood vaccines. Monday's decision also stays Kennedy's appointments to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which Kennedy remade after removing all of the previous members. The pauses are temporary as the case continues to play out in court. And President Trump said that he is, quote, thrilled with FCC Chairman Brendan Carr, who threatened to revoke broadcasters' licenses after Trump criticized media outlets for their coverage of the war with Iran. Carr warned broadcasters that they needed to, quote, course correct their news coverage before potential action by his agency. He did not explicitly point to broadcasters' coverage of the war, but his warning came after Trump posted complaints online about the media's reporting of the conflict. Revoking broadcast licenses due to objections by the White House would be an unprecedented expansion of the FCC's powers. And joining me now is tonight's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Welcome to you both. Jeannie, when we consider this notion of revoking licenses, the idea that the administration is pushing back on media coverage of the war in Iran specifically, is the issue here the message the media is putting out or the inconsistency with the message that the administration is putting out?
It's the message coming from the administration. And of course, as you know better than anyone, Kayleigh, it is not unusual for the White House, any White House, to have frustration with the kind of coverage they're getting. We saw it with Joe Biden. We saw it with Barack Obama. I mean, every president feels frustration with the Fourth Estate. That said, very few go to the extent of either threatening the press or having an FCC chairman like Brendan Carr threaten to remove their licenses. And of course, as we heard from the Democrat on the FCC, the only Democrat still there, it is very unlikely that they would be able to remove the licenses. And so the big threat here is really self-censorship. Does the media or do certain media outlets feel so concerned about the impact of their coverage that they pull back a bit? And that's certainly what the White House and what the FCC chair are hoping for. But we all have to hope the opposite, that they continue to give the fair coverage that's needed on a war which impacts all of us so much.
Well, and when we consider the war itself and the messaging that's coming out of the Department of Defense, Rick, of course, we have seen the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the chair of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, briefing the media, but the people gathered in the room are not necessarily representative of the traditional outlets that would, given the restrictions the Pentagon put on its press corps, and many turned in their badges as a result. So I wonder what you make of all of this, the idea that I just wonder if it seems to you that the White House feels they're losing control of the narrative, or if they never had it in the first place when it comes to this war with Iran.
Yeah, look, I think this is a much broader issue. I mean, there's a bifurcation politically of the media. They're not what they used to be. We have a very opinionated press, both on the right and on the left, outside of an outlet like Bloomberg, who really respects the fact-based reporting. The rest falls upon party lines. So you can't really blame the president for sort of working the ref over there at the FCC. And really, at some point, we have to address where we can find fact-based reporting and encourage these media outlets to do that. So, yeah, it's a bit of a scrambled egg. And yet we do have people like Ron Johnson who spoke out against this move by FCC, Brendan Carr saying that the most important aspect of media oversight is the fact that they the regulators respect the First Amendment. And so I think there's enough correction in the system to avoid something really bad happening. But I do think it's a broader issue that maybe sometime when you don't have a shooting war going on in the Middle East, you really need to tackle as a public policy initiative.
Well, so when we consider the war going on in the Middle East, we know that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has openly advocated for not having any more wars in the Middle East, and yet he is standing by President Trump as he pursues this one. We actually saw them together in the Oval Office today for the first time since this conflict began, and Vance was pressed about what has changed for him. This was his answer.
I think one big difference, Phil, is that we have a smart president, whereas in the past we've had dumb presidents. And I trust President Trump to get the job done, to do a good job for the American people, and to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
The only difference is we have a smart president now. Rick, what do you make of that response?
Yeah, it's pretty simplistic. I think that I can't tell whether today's meeting with J.D. Vance was a woodshed or some kind of other initiative. I know they announced this new, sort of reform thing that he's doing. But the bottom line is it's going to be very hard for him over any kind of long-term process politically to walk away from previous comments that he had. I mean, the political process will keep reminding him that, he was dead set against these kinds of initiatives, especially as early as 6 months into this administration as vice president. So he's got some explaining to do to the American voters. But at some point, not now, that'll become a much more relevant political issue.
Yeah, I do wonder about the explanation from someone who is strongly against intervention to now being okay with intervention, and potentially not just intervention in the Middle East, but we know obviously about the Don Roe Doctrine as it pertains to the Western Hemisphere. And Jeannie, I'd like to take a listen here and watch on Bloomberg TV and radio to what President Trump had to say in the Oval Office specifically about Cuba. Here he is.
You know, all my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah.
Taking Cuba, Jeannie, do you take that literally?
Absolutely. We've seen him go into Venezuela, kidnap the leader of Venezuela, bring him to the U.S. and put him on trial. We have seen him twice now bomb Iran and kill the leader of Iran. So absolutely, he will try, if he can, to quote unquote take Cuba. And it is so egregious to think about where we are today as we are in a war that this president cannot tell us why we are there, what the end goal is, what the strategy is, what a win means. As all this is going on, he is talking about doing the very same thing in another country with no regard to U.S. law, no regard to the U.S. Constitution, no regard to international law. It is egregious beyond question, and it's hard to for me to tease out which is more egregious. J.D. Vance trying to say that he didn't mean what he said on the campaign trail. The only reason he was opposed to foreign wars was because all our previous presidents are dumb. Or President Trump now saying he's going to go in and take Cuba. It is what we are hearing from this White House. The American public is hearing it. And this is why for 26 and 28, the Republicans have a real problem on their hands.
Well, but Rick, when we consider the pattern here, obviously no one was shedding tears when Maduro was ousted in Venezuela, at least in the U.S. The same goes for the late Ayatollah in Iran. I'm sure many would say the same if we were to see a leadership change in Cuba. Is it so much the idea of causing this change or how he might intend to go about it?
You know, I wouldn't get hooked up into the process. Cuba has been exploited by the Russians and the Chinese for many, many decades, and their people are hungry. They don't have electricity. They don't have jobs. They don't have health care. This is a crime of the century, how Cuba has been treated by our adversaries. And the best possible thing I would think that could happen is to work out in a relationship with the United States government, both on a political and economic basis, that allows some freedom of the Cuban people to find economic success on their own and with our backing. There are a lot of people who want to help Cuba, both in the private sector and the public sector, and we ought to be allowed to do it. How Trump gets there is probably less important than getting there quickly so that we can avert a crisis in Cuba.
Just quickly, Rick, how quick is quickly in this instance?
Oh, I don't think, based on the reporting, you already have, nationwide blackouts and severe shortages. I think something needs to be done in the immediate short term because we know this story, right? We've seen it in other parts of the Caribbean. When you get to this point in time in a collapse, it gets worse by the minute. So I think quicker anything can happen here, the better for the people of Cuba.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan-Zaino, our political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them. Thank you so much, as always. And for more coverage from Cuba to Venezuela to what's going on in Iran, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And we'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.